Good morning. I trust each of you are well and making the best of this difficult situation. I'm so thankful for each of you and the technology that we have that we could even connect like this. My hope is this message will be a source of encouragement during this unsettling time. I remember one of the most scary experiences I had came back in high school. It was a Friday afternoon in October. Football practice had just finished. I headed home to grab a few things, and then I was going to turn around after getting some gas and changing to go back to Portsmouth. But as I went through the intersection in front of my house, there was another car that came through, and we collided. I wasn't wearing a seatbelt, so I ended up going right through the windshield. I was told later that their car went end over end several times. It was a pretty scary ordeal. I found myself on the side of the road with a classmate that came running across the street, holding my head in a towel to keep me from bleeding. Soon, I don't know how long I laid there, but I found myself in the back of an ambulance, which was probably one of the scariest parts, because you're sitting there strapped to this stretcher and wondering if the back doors are going to go flying, you're going to go flying out. It just wasn't a fun ride. My head was killing. I don't know how long I was in the hospital. I don't remember. I just remember going home looking like Frankenstein across my head and with a pretty awful headache. It was a scary ordeal. We're facing a pretty scary ordeal too. The coronavirus is probably on the top of most of our lists right now. It's natural to be concerned about your health and the health of your family right now. As many of you know, my son moved to New York this past year, and he's on a worship team down there at a great church. They too have suspended public worship services. However, the worship team got together and played some music and for their live stream, and only to discover a day later that their worship pastor is tested positive for the coronavirus. So we're feeling the weight of this pandemic just like you. For others, you're dealing with the financial picture and the impact of the situation. Maybe your job is shut down, or the hours have been changed. I know for us as a church, the financial uncertainty is a real issue that we're dealing with. We're certainly dependent on people's continued support, and we hope for their continued support. But we deal with that too. You know, if we're not meeting for public gatherings, we're not sure how people are going to respond, if they're going to send in their offerings, or you know, we've made provisions for online giving and that kind of thing, but you don't know. We're not able to gather together. So we're trusting God along with you for financial situations. But fortunately, despite these very real concerns, we have a peace that comes from God. Scripture is full of examples when fear was very, very real, yet God provided a path towards peace. Today, in our time together, I want to examine a couple times when the disciples of Christ faced some very scary situations, and yet through their time with Christ, they learned to trust Him, and God provided the answers. Matthew records the first incident we want to talk about. It's in chapter 8. I'm going to be reading from the New Living Translation. It says, Jesus got into the boat and started to cross the lake with his disciples. Then suddenly a fierce storm struck the lake, with waves breaking into the boat. And the first thing I want you to notice is that not only were the disciples subject to storms, they were subject to severe ones. Matthew didn't use words like a rain shower or even a downpour to describe the event, because none of those would have captured the true terror of the moment that they were experiencing. Instead, he uses the Greek word seismos, a quake, a trembling eruption of sea and sky is how it's defined. And the term, we see it even in our English language, like seismologist, which of course describes somebody who studies earthquakes, or seismograph, the instrument that records them. It's not by accident that Matthew chooses this word. He wanted to describe the terror and the panic that they were feeling in that boat. The same word is only used by Matthew 2 other times in his entire gospel. In Matthew 27, at Jesus' death, when Calvary shook and there was an earthquake, and then in Matthew 28, when Jesus rose from the dead, the graveyard trembled. I wanted to point this out because somewhere along the line, many of us have bought into this notion that Christians are somehow immune to storms altogether. The truth is the disciples weren't, and we aren't either. Let's go back to our text because there's another piece I don't want you to miss. It says, when Jesus got into the boat and he started across the lake with his disciples, and then look at verse 24. It says, suddenly a fierce storm struck the lake. Some storms are expected and some simply aren't. It's one thing to experience storms as a result of our disobedience when we have messed up. Those storms tend to be inevitable and often predictable. We can understand the Jonah scenario, right? God told him to do one thing, he does the exact opposite, and all of a sudden the consequences show up. We get that. We've come to understand that disobedience has consequences. Not necessarily because God is an angry God or a vengeful God, but poor choices always have some form of collateral damage. But I'm not talking about that in this case. What I'm talking about here is about seemingly unwarranted, unexpected storms. How do you respond? Because this was a sudden, unexpected storm that they didn't necessarily prepare for or know was coming. I like how Eugene Peterson's message puts it. He said they got into the boat, his disciples with him. The next thing they knew, they were in a severe storm. Again, it's worth noting, in this instance, their storm came in the midst of their obedience, not their disobedience. These guys weren't running from God. These guys were in the boat at Jesus' instruction with Jesus. They didn't commit some heinous sin and invoking God's judgment. They did exactly what Jesus told them to do, yet they find themselves in the midst of the fiercest storm of their lives. Some have suggested that during our storms, that's when the power of God is made known the greatest. Regardless of how fierce or unexpected of the storm, the power of God is still greater. And maybe that's something somebody needed to hear today. And again, it's what we expect to hear from the pastor, right? When we're facing a scary pandemic like this, we need the pastor to say, hey, it's going to be okay. God is still greater, and he is. But how does it really happen in our lives? How do we keep fear from gaining control in our lives? How do we overcome the blitz that's coming from the news and the social media and that's flooded with news about the corona and the shortages at stores? I mean, we live in a country we're not used to walking down aisles and seeing stores shelves empty, or when businesses shut down. I think it's worth something to remember that God is still greater even in the midst of that. Let's go back to the text. Jesus got into the boat, started across the lake with his disciples. Suddenly a fierce storm struck the lake with waves breaking into the boat. But Jesus was sleeping, it says. And the disciples went and woke him up, shouting, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. In Mark's gospel, he too records the event that happened, but Mark gives us an interesting detail about the disciples' response. In Mark's Gospel, chapter 4, it says, Jesus was sleeping in the back of the boat with his head on a cushion. And the disciples woke him up and said, Teacher, don't you care that we're going to drown? They didn't ask about his ability. Hey, can you calm this storm? They didn't ask about his knowledge. Jesus, you're sleeping. Are you aware of this storm? They didn't even ask about his experience. Hey, do you have any experience in calming storms? Rather, they asked about his love. Don't you care? And it's important to recognize what fear does to faith. Fear always attacks our confidence in God and his goodness. We begin to wonder if God still loves and remembers us. Because if God can sleep in our storms, if his eyes can stay shut when ours can't close, we tend to wonder if he really cares. Fear often unleashes a swarm of doubts that attack our faith in God's goodness. But what I want you to remember during this storm is that storms don't determine or dictate how good God is or isn't. God's goodness, like all his attributes, are constant and unchanging. The writer of Hebrews says Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. In Malachi, God declares, I am the Lord, I do not change. In the New Testament book of James, it says, every good and perfect gift is from above, coming down from the Father in heaven of lights, who does not change like shifting shadows. Do you want to know how to keep fear from consuming your hearts and thoughts during this outbreak? Remember, God is good. He's good all the time, regardless of our current circumstance. His goodness doesn't change. Let's go back to the text again. Jesus says, why are you afraid? You have so little faith. Then he got up, rebuked the winds and the waves, and suddenly there was a great calm. And the disciples were amazed. Who is this man? They asked. Even the winds and the waves obey him. And again, don't miss this. Not only does fear raise doubts in God's goodness, fear always seems to affect our memories. Regardless of how scary the storm was, the disciples had every reason to believe that Jesus had it under control. By now they had seen him perform countless miracles. Matthew records in chapter 4, Jesus traveled throughout the region of Galilee, teaching in their synagogues and announcing the good news about the kingdom, and healed every kind of disease. They had witnessed him heal a leper with the touch, a Roman officer by just saying the word. Peter's mother-in-law was healed right before this event it's recorded. They saw demons scattered. They saw, again, countless people get healed. Why doesn't anyone remember these miracles? You'd think that each of these miracles that required a supernatural intervention of God would be enough to build their faith so that they would trust God for the situation that they found themselves in right then. But it seems that fear creates a sort of spiritual amnesia. It dulls our memory. It causes us to forget what Jesus has done and how good God is. How many times have God answered your prayers? How many times have you experienced his power personally in the midst of a difficult situation? Yet somehow, during this latest storm, we tend to forget those times. But hear me, if you want to avoid fear gaining control during this current storm, we need to remember God's power is still available and it hasn't diminished. Remember those times when God met your need and healed your body? You weren't feeling well, you prayed, you get together with your family, and all of a sudden God changed the situation that you were experiencing. Remember those times finances were limited, the bills were piling up, yet God provided. God's power hasn't lessened over the past couple of weeks just because Corona showed up. God is still good. God is still able to heal. God is still able to provide. Then probably the single most powerful thing that fights fear from gaining control, we see after the disciples experience probably the scariest thing that they've ever seen or witnessed, the crucifixion of Christ. What came after that was truly a game changer. John records this in chapter 20. He said, that Sunday evening, the disciples were meeting behind closed doors because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Seems to be pretty much an understatement. Seems like a pretty reasonable response after seeing Jesus experience the worst, most brutal death that anyone could ever experience. It's one thing to believe about Jesus when you're witnessing countless miracles, when deaf people are hearing for the first time, when the blind people, their eyes are being opened, or the crippled guys getting up and walking and dancing. That's easy to follow Christ during those times. When lepers are being miraculous and instantaneously cleansed, or when thousands of people are being fed just because of a small lunch that a responsible mom packed for his kid. And don't forget there's that walking on water thing. The idea of Jesus being the Messiah when you're experiencing all of those kind of supernatural acts was easy. Their faith in God was obvious and strong. But then he's arrested. Then he goes through the mockery of a trial and he's sentenced to death. And doubts begin to surface. How could God let the Messiah be murdered? He was the hope of the new kingdom. He was their hope. A kingdom that now seemingly is dead along with their hope. And the idea that the kingdom that these guys supported, propagated, was now shut down or trying to be shut down by the religious establishment, it was understood that, or understandable rather, that these guys would be nervous and afraid as well. So it makes sense that these guys were hiding behind closed doors and were afraid. But let's continue. John 20:19, that Sunday evening they were they were meeting behind closed doors, locked doors, because they were afraid of the Jewish leaders. Suddenly Jesus was standing among them. "Peace be with you," he said. And as he spoke, he showed them the wounds in his hands and his sides, and they were filled with joy when they saw the Lord. Again he said, "Peace be with you. As the Father has sent me, so I'm sending you." The single greatest reason that the disciples were no longer controlled by fear and they were able to move forward was the resurrection of Christ. They no longer feared death because death didn't have the final word. The resurrection proved that Jesus is and was God, that he was his son, and that everything that he said was then true. Suddenly, for the first time, the disciples knew that they didn't have to be afraid. And as you read through the book of Acts, which chronicles the lives after the lives of the disciples after the resurrection, there's this fearlessness that is characterized in their lives. For us, 2,000 years later, unfortunately, the resurrection is typically reserved for Easter. But for those first followers of Jesus, the resurrection was their everyday reason for being. It was their source of confidence. It was their source of boldness. It was what brought purpose and focus to their lives. It was their message. The resurrection validated everything that Jesus had taught them and everything that he had taught the crowds. There was an amazing example of this in the early part of Acts when Peter and John, they had just healed this lame guy at the temple, and they were dragged in before the council. And it was said that the members of the council were amazed when they saw the boldness of Peter and John, for they could see that they were ordinary men with no special training in scriptures, but they also recognized them as men who had been with Jesus. So let me ask you again, why are you afraid? Storms happen. The size and the severity of the storms don't matter to God. His goodness hasn't changed. His power hasn't diminished. He still heals. He still provides. He still knows your situation. We don't have to fear death. As followers of Christ, we have a hope because of what he has done for us. I know this is a scary time, but you can give your fear to God, and I know he'll impact your heart in a very special way. We love you. We hope you have a great day. If you have any questions in this format, send me some remarks, some comments, and we'll do what we can do to serve you as we get through this situation. God bless you.